of, well, that aged well. And if you don't watch this live, don't worry, you can watch this back to back after we have finished the recording. So it's still there after we're done. But so don't worry if you missed, you haven't missed anything other than being able to ask this question live. Speaking of, this is live. So if you have any burning questions regarding World War One, which is what we're going to discuss today, that is what now is a chance to do so. And we are once again joined by our good friend of ours, Chris Kempschel, who last time he was on, we discussed the first month and what led up to the World War One, and that was a great episode that you absolutely should check out. He also have written a recent book that is about Star Wars, that is kind of a history book of the Galactic Empire, and it's such a fun read that you absolutely should check out. But I'm going to be a little AFK, as to use the young kids' word language, so because I have to share that we are live. So why don't you begin talking a little bit what you are interested in, how you are interested in World War One, and
Yeah,
what how studying it, how have you changed and the views on the Great War as it's called. So let's
yeah.
talk a little bit of your way into World War One.
I think that's a good question. So I mean, if we go kind of all the way back, in that I never actually wanted to be a historian. I always wanted to be I wanted to be a
Star Wars
football.
nerd.
Oh God, I was I'd achieved that long before I started thinking about jobs things. No, I wanted to be a like a football soccer commentator.
Mm.
And I studied
Didn't we all?
yeah, God. And I dropped history in secondary school and I didn't study it at like my A levels or at university properly, or kind of from my undergraduate degree at university. And then when I realized that I wasn't going to be a football commentator because you don't need that many.
Mm.
Um, and whilst I was doing my undergraduate degree, which was in media studies, I had taken like little school courses on the side, and one of those was about the First World War. And I got kind of introduced to the concept of what historians now kind of generally refer to as the myth of the First World War, which is, mud, blood, trenches, everybody
Mm.
died, all of that kind of stuff. And I found it really, really interesting. And when I realized I wasn't going to be a football commentator, I kind of then did a master's in it was kind of an international relations course, but it was kind of contemporary war and peace studies was what it was called. And then I moved on to do my PhD in history, and that was on Allied relations in the
Mm.
First World War. So it was about how
That
British
is
and French
not like an easy
soldiers.
topic.
Yeah, oh, yeah, God, it's not like there's a dozen different kind of language
Yeah.
variations just in that.
Yeah.
Um, so then, yeah, it was on kind of British and French soldiers and how they got along with each other. And then I kind of moved further into academia, and I wrote a book, which then brought the Americans into the equation about based off my thesis. And I've been kind of working in the sphere of First World War studies, both in regards to kind of Allied relations, but also memory of the war and popular conceptions of the war, and also the way that the war is kind of constructed and represented in modern media. So I've done a lot of stuff about First World War computer games, and I finished my PhD in 2013. So
Mm.
I've been a fully function, and I started my PhD in 2008. So if we take it from the starting point, it's been it's not that far off 2 decades
No.
of being a First World War historian. And at the moment, there's an academic kind of organization
I
about
actually
the First World
finished
War.
high school in 2013,
Oh
and
God, I'm
it
just going to
feels
turn
so
to
long
dust.
ago now.
It's going to be the shortest live stream
Yeah.
ever as I just
Oh.
erode, collapse into
Oh.
compost.
You make me
Um,
feel old. Why did
yeah,
I
God,
regret asking this question?
straight through my heart.
Oh.
But there's an international academic organisation called the International Society for First World War Studies that's been going for nearly 25 years itself, and I'm the president of it at the moment, which is a lot of fun. And so like the First World War has been a big part of my life. I'm going to be 42 this year,
Ooh.
and if we're taking that, I started my PhD in
Yeah.
2008. We're talking half of my life now that I've been doing this. So yeah, I've been playing around in the First World War for quite a while.
Is there any special area in that from the First World War that you find particularly interesting? Like we discussed the early stages, like I said in our episode. But is there any specific area of the war that you find more interesting than others?
So one of the things that's also been a big part of the way that the International Society functions is to consider the war as a transnational event. That actually, there are limits on how much you can talk about the British experience of the war,
Mm.
or the French experience of the war, or the German experience of the war. Whilst there are things that are, particular to Britain and things that are particular to France and things that are particular to Germany, it makes much more sense to imagine the transnational experience of the war, how Britain's experience impacts the French experience, how Germany's experience impacts the French, and all how it goes in different directions. And that's kind of really, really key to my work on Allied relations. So I always find that interesting, the overlaps of experience, how experience influences experience. Um, I kind of have a long-standing interest in 1918. I find
Yeah.
1918 as a fascinating year. I
Mm.
definitely want to do some more work
Mm.
at some point in on 1918. Um, and there were kind of little bits and pieces along the side, like I have like an ongoing pet interest in a sense that I am in no way an expert. And the more you talk to First World War historians, the more they actually start caveating,
Yeah.
like I'm not an expert in this, but I like have like an ongoing pet interest in Portugal,
Ooh.
and the First World War as a really weird, interesting case study. But I think one of the biggest things that emerged out of kind of First World War academic history in recent years that I find that I'm really, really, really interested in is definitely something I want to do kind of more on, but it's kind of basically been undertaken by better historians than me. Um, is the concept of what's called the Greater War theory,
Mm.
in that the First World War, as we conceptualize it between 1914 and 1918, is not the entirety of everything that's going on. It might be like the focal point for an awful lot of violence, but stuff happens before the First World War, and quite a lot happens after the First World War that
Yeah.
still has its roots in the First World War. The Russian Civil War, the German Civil War,
Yeah.
the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Greek-Turkish War, revolutions in Central and Southern Europe, genocides. A bunch of
And
stuff
something
happens.
that surprised me, especially reading on the Ottoman part, is that they didn't really make peace with the British until 1923. They were technically
Yes,
still at war until 1923. That's a long time, but it was
yeah,
a proxy war, to be fair. But they never really made peace with the British.
exactly. So the Greater War theory posits that a better framing of what we might call the First World War is to take it from like 1912 to
Yeah.
1923. Um, and that theory, I think, it's the type of thing that I would like to see making more headway into kind of popular conceptions. Or I understand that trying to tell people that these events that they have in their heads, like 1914 to 1918,
Yeah.
those dates aren't great. Is like trying to push a boulder uphill. It's like trying to tell somebody that the Second World War is not 1939 to 1945. It's
Mm.
like those are the pillars
Yeah.
of memory for this. But actually, by extending the war backwards to 1912, and certainly by extending it out to 1923, does actually really, really help make a great deal more sense of what is going on and the aftermath of the war, and why people might think that the war wasn't won, or it wasn't a
Yeah.
clean victory, or it wasn't a victory at all. You start to kind of bring in this kind of collapse of systems, particularly in kind of Central and
Mm.
Eastern Europe, and it does start to help make a little bit more sense about what comes afterwards. Whereas taking the armistice of 1918 as the end is
Yeah.
problematic for me as a historian now.
I mean, you had all these mini military groups in Germany as well after the First World War that were
Yeah, absolutely.
because of the disarmament of the ex-soldiers that formed all these dissolutions, such as the Freikorps, etc. There are several of these paramilitary groups
Yeah,
in Germany after the First World War. One of them, of course, would be later John Hitler when he became, politician. So, like yeah, I totally agree. You shouldn't really end the First World War in 1918 at all. And
yeah,
if you look at books on the Eastern Front, they don't really end in 1917 when Russia made peace with Germany. They
yeah.
ended in 1923 after the Russian Civil War. So for them, it the Eastern Front doesn't really end until 1923.
Yes, and even if you take like the main combatants, so there's an armistice been signed. Britain, France, and America, and they're all going home. Except they're not. There's quite a lot of British, French, and American soldiers who get sent to the Russian Civil War and are still fighting in
Yeah,
1919 and 1920. And then if you get things like the Irish War for Independence and then the Irish Civil War, which British soldiers are fighting in, and absolutely has some of its roots in the Easter Rising during the First World War,
mm,
that these 1918 cut-offs just don't work anymore. And even for things like, like the war medals that a lot of British soldiers get, they take their endpoint as 1919 because that's when the Treaty of Versailles is signed after the Paris Peace Conference.
Yeah.
So 1918 isn't even the end of the war in that conception of it. It's become a very odd
Yeah.
cut-off point.
Mm. And you mentioned, to go back to when you talked about Portugal, something I find fascinating and kind of a bit understudied, but you mentioned there is the Italians in World War One. That's the part that I want to definitely read more about. I feel like a lot of people don't know much of, and I don't either. I'm not going to pretend like I do. But the Italian front in World War One is super fascinating to me, and
Yeah.
that's something I want to look up
So
more about.
I'm gonna say this with both, as I'm gonna be professional, but I'm also
Mm-hmm.
gonna be me in that. So one of my good friends, Dr. Vanda Wilcox, is a leading historian of Italy in the First World War. Her books are fantastic. You should absolutely get her on to talk about
Oh
Italy
yeah.
in the First World War. Um, but that being said, and if you're watching this on catch up at any point, Vanda, I'd like to say that I'm maintaining consistency. I like to pretend that Italy wasn't in the First World War, and that
Really?
every time that Vanda mentions it, that's the first time that I'm learning about it. Um, because what better way to really kind of ingratiate yourself to your colleagues and be like, I never knew that Italy were in the First World War. You've known me for 15 years, Chris. You've heard these conversations and you've heard this.
Mm-hmm.
You've been at my book launches and stuff, or you've read my books. This is not the first time that you've discovered
Mm-hmm.
that Italy are in the First World War, but I just think it's funny. But seriously, you should absolutely get Vander on to talk about
Oh
Italy in
yeah.
the First World War because it is really, really interesting.
Mm. So I want to talk a little bit. Let's begin on the Western Front and talk about the mobilization of, or just begin would be the wrong word here, but let's go to the Western Front rather and talk about the and I want to especially talk about the treatment of the soldiers as well because they weren't treated as I remember reading G.J. Mayer's book a while ago where he talked about the appalling treatment of the soldiers in the trenches and the Western generally, how they were really looked down upon, like kind of like meat for slaughter in a sense in the First World War.
Um, yeah, there's a yes and a no answer to that. I mean, if we go kind of if we take Britain as an example, pre-war, the army is not viewed as a particularly good
Mm.
occupation. It's one of the
Yeah.
reasons why Britain is a volunteer army because nobody wants to join the army and people don't want their sons to join the army. The army was the solution in British society for the third son problem, which that if you're a wealthy family, your first son, well, they'll inherit the family business, and they'll continue the line. Second son will join the clergy or something like that and be a man of God, and the third son could join the army and try not to die in a manner that's embarrassing to the family. It's that kind of it's not and certainly for the working classes and like I mean there's a benefit to joining the army, you get regular pay, you get regular food, you get your clothes are all sorted, you get a place to live, most of your needs are covered, so it's kind of pure profit in a sense. um and then obviously
How easy was it
the
to climb in the ranks of the British Army at that time if you
hard
were a peasant
the
soldier?
yeah hard if you were like a working class soldier. This is still the age of commissions
Mm.
and the like, and certainly when the war comes, the kind of the upper ranks are largely reserved for the middle classes and the upper classes, um, with some variation as the war goes on. um, but what you end up with when the war actually comes and then the kind of the armies start crashing into each other, particularly in the early part, is it firstly it's very, very confusing. Is that it's you're at a point of kind of confluence of technology where defensive warfare, as becomes clear as it goes on, is very much in the ascendancy. You do start with a war of movement, but after the Battle of the Marne in kind of September of 1914, and the German failure to take Paris, and you end up basically everybody leapfrogging themselves up to the coast. You then get into a situation where trying to issue orders and communicate with people in the field is really, really hard. This is pre-radio. It's kind of you've got a technological ceiling into how easy it is to orchestrate a battle. in this time period. And then obviously you move into trenches and trench warfare. And you end up with two opposing views of the merits of trench warfare. You've got the Germans on one side who are like, God, we were so close to Paris. We could have, if we'd have taken Paris and the Schlieffen Plan comes
Mm.
off and we can go and stick it to the Russians and everybody goes home happy. But it didn't happen. So what about if, like contestants on a game show, we just bank what we've got? And we've got a load of Belgium and we've got a good chunk of France, and we'll dig in now for the defensive portion, and you end up with like big concrete German bunkers and stuff like that.
Would that been a plausible solution if they had sued for peace at that time, or would that been a hard no from, or wasn't the idea of total war yet in people's mind?
It wasn't yet at a point of total war in 1914. That doesn't really start to kind of fully come in into kind of 1915 into 1916 time, and I think it would have probably been a hard no, certainly from the French at that point, because their alternative view of trench warfare, and the British used to complain whenever they took over French trenches, say like, God, it's a mess, it's disgusting and it's dirty and the defenses aren't built up, and there's no structures to any of this. And the French viewpoint is, well, the Germans across the way are camped in our country. I'm not planning on staying in this trench very long. Why would I make it comfortable? Why would I make it built up and defensible? I plan on attacking. And, as our allies, presumably you plan on attacking as well. So you then get this situation where the Germans are digging in and planning to stay, and the French and the British are thinking, well, we have to go on the offensive. So why do we need to build up our trenches into anything particularly good or particularly defensible? And a lot of the battles that you get in that 1915 period, where you get, 1915 is a terrible year. It's a terrible year for the Allies on the Western Front. Um, and what you end up getting in that time period is a lot of these attacks against kind of fortified German positions, because the idea is that we just have to attack, we'll drive them out. And obviously, losses add up and casualties add up and morale takes a hit. And it's only kind of after that point when both sides start to kind of solidify their defensive positions in the trenches, particularly the British and the French start thinking about, actually properly fortifying their positions. I mean, you end up with kind of German attacks at Ypres in 1915, and then you get German attacks at Verdun in 1916 that are actually Germany going on the offensive. But the number of German offensives on the Western Front once 1914 is over are reasonably negligible. You might get occasional kind of pushes and the like, but the Germans are pretty intent to sit it in and see if they can wait it out, or make the most of an opportunity, or like force a victory at Verdun. But they're not attacking with the regularity that the Allies end up doing.
Let's talk a little bit about life in the trenches, and both on the German and Allied side, and how life expectancy and what was the daily life in the trenches. And I'm currently actually, before we started this, started watching Thou Shalt Not Grow Old, because I thought it was a good
Yeah.
time to start as any, and you see a little bit about life in the trenches. They have how it days goes by, and it's quite fascinating to view. Of course, I don't have, for lack of a better term, renewed footage that the Peter Jackson uses. So and as well, what are your thoughts on the movie, and how well does it represent the trenches and World War I
Okay.
climax?
So those are two big questions, and I'll start with daily life in the trenches to
Mm,
begin with. Boring. The
yeah.
overwhelming emotion of soldiers during the First World War is that they are bored. Um, because again, we think of this kind of concept of constant over the top and artillery barrages and ongoing fighting. It's just not like that. It's just long periods of inactivity, and soldiers would maybe spend 3 or 4 days in the front line at a time, and then they would start working their way backwards through the line. So the majority of their time, they're not even in the front line trenches. Like it's only like a portion of their month, a really small portion of their month. If there's a big attack going on, that's going to change. But general day-to-day life is trench maintenance, digging, sorting out latrines. If you're further behind the lines, it'll be some kind of drill or marching or training, and then periods of leave behind the line with just nothing happening. And depending where you are, the kind of geology of the trenches, places like the Somme, where it's where you get a lot of clay, and or kind of rather kind of Passchendaele and Flanders as well. You get a lot of clay at Passchendaele and Flanders, and you get a lot of chalk at the Somme. So the geology of the trenches will impact what your experience is like. So obviously, when it rains in Passchendaele and Flanders, clay, water, mud, and it's awful. And at the Somme, it's a slightly different experience. So where you are is going to have an impact on what kind of day that you're having. And there are some parts of the line that are just quiet, that are just kind of perennially
All
quiet.
quiet on the Western Front, eh?
Yeah. And you'll get places where the British and the French on one side and the Germans on the other side will come to an agreement about not trying to kill each other effectively. They'll give heads up about when artillery bombardments are going to happen. They'll have an understanding that it's a semi-arranged truce, and this isn't walking out into no man's land and playing football with each other as a Christmas
Yeah.
truce thing. It's putting signs up above trench walls
Mm.
or shouting stuff across no man's land and the like, just so you can kind of take a live and let live policy with it. So actual fighting is relatively rare, except when you get a big battle, you get a ton of fighting. But like on any given day on the Western Front, I would expect the vast majority of people to be bored. It's why they write so many letters. It's why they demand so many letters from home. It's the only thing that breaks the monotony of getting post, and feeling like you're kind of connected to the outside world. When it comes to They Shall Not Grow Old, the issues that I have with the documentary, with the film, would immediately evaporate if it was renamed. If it was called Peter Jackson's Vision of the First World War,
Yeah.
then I have no problems with it. The issues that I have with the film is that a lot of people take it as like an unedited, perfectly reconstructed documentary,
Mm.
and it's not. It's completely
I mean, we
re-edited.
know that they added sound effect and etc.
They
for
added
that.
sound effects, they added color, they took like really iconic films that I love, like the 1916 documentary The Battle of the Somme,
Mm.
and re-edit it in order and move things around so it suggests that some parts are taking place in like 1918 and stuff like that, which I'm not super keen on, because it breaks up the original footage of it. I
Yeah.
also think that people went very over the top on the color, the recoloring. Basically, people saying, "Oh, wow, it's like you're there. It's like it was shot yesterday." It's like, no, it's not. It just isn't. It does not look like it was shot
Yeah.
yesterday. And at times, the coloring of it is really wonky, to the extent that sometimes it like breaks down as people walk across the scene, and like people's legs and that disappear. So yeah, okay, the colorization does in some places give an extra dimension to it, and I can understand that for the audience, seeing things in color is better than seeing things in black and white.
Yeah.
And again, a lot of my complaints are about the stupid whines of a First World War historian who's wasted their lives on this. And I understand I am not the target market for Peter Jackson's. It's for everybody else, and you know I'm actually kind of fine with that. That it's fine that he's not pitching it at me, who goes, "Hang on a second, I recognise this scene from the Battle of the Somme documentary," because who cares? But I think that a lot of people got caught up in it as if it was this is a real thing. Well, no, it's a constructed, edited documentary, like all documentaries are. And if it had been called Peter Jackson's View of the First World War, that takes away a lot of that issue for me, because it positions Peter Jackson as the editor and the documentary maker of it, rather than we've taken all of this stuff and we've recolorized it and it's perfect and it's just how it was. It's like, no, it wasn't. And the sound effects, and sometimes they've added stuff in about people saying things and they're not
Yeah.
saying that. You're just assuming that they're saying that because it's a crowd scene. And some of the creative license I have a problem with.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was wildly successful and it reached a big audience, and it got people interested and connected with the First World War in a way that other things during the centenary and after the centenary didn't. So you know what, some of it I can live with, and some of it I find annoying, and some of it is just the grumpy moans of a First World War historian.
Mm. What I was speaking of going back to the trenches. And we spoke. I need to look up the episode because I don't have his name in my head. We spoke about Namasland a while ago with the guy that's recommended.
Oh, Paul Reed.
Paul Reed, that's it. Yeah, Paul Reed. And what I found interesting is how they easily people could not get lost in the trenches
Yes.
as well, and that you had names to kind of recognize where you are. Suddenly you're in Berlinstrasse when you were supposed to just
Yeah,
Piccadilly,
or
say
Piccadilly
Piccadilly
Circus,
Circus.
and
Yeah,
yeah.
so it's how easy it actually were to get lost in the trenches.
The film 1917, the opening of 1917, that first kind of
Mm.
10-15 minutes does a really, really good job of showing how confusing and hectic and crowded and busy the connecting trenches are
Yeah,
behind the line. Like lots of people moving around and you're not quite sure where you are, or, which regiment's holding this, and I'm trying to find this particular trench. It's like an anthill behind the lines in that, or kind of, or behind the front line in that bit, and it kind of
my
gets
only issue with the movie, and I think it's a great film, but I didn't like that they tried to do the one shot thing. It didn't always work for me in the
yeah.
movie. I
I
think
mean,
you should have done a bit. I get the idea, but it just didn't always work for me.
at times I did very much play, and again, this was kind of like my media degree background coming through, kind of playing spot the cut
Yeah,
moment when something would pass in front of the camera, and you can say, okay, they've used that to break
yeah.
up the footage and the like. Um, but I've been talking for a while now. In that 1917 is the best First World War computer game I've ever watched,
Mm.
because the narrative structure
I mean,
of
really,
the
movie,
film.
not movie, not computer game.
No, I think
Uh,
it's a computer game.
oh,
It's
right.
structured like a computer game.
Oh, right. Yeah.
All of the narrative beats are taken out of computer games, and it
Mm.
feels very much like a semi first person, third person shooter.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And if you think about like any first person shooter, there's a bit where one of the characters is crossing over a bridge that's sunk into the water. And I'm watching and go, well, there's clearly a sniper in the tower because I've played this game before. There's always a sniper in the tower
Mm.
whenever you're doing these things. And then you've got the sneak and the stealth level, and then you've got the battle level,
Yeah.
and all of these things, I think, are a really the 1917 is a really interesting example of the way that actually computer game narrative design is impacting cinema. And what we
Yeah.
normally see in historic film and historic games is the other way around. Is that when films like Saving Private Ryan came out and Enemy at the Gates and kind of that Second World War cinema boom at the end of the 1990s, you then got a bunch of computer games that just reenacted Saving Private Ryan storming Omaha Beach or being a sniper in Stalingrad.
Yeah.
And they took their inspiration from cinema. But I think it's interesting that 1917 seems to be taking its inspiration from games.
That's an interesting. I haven't thought about that before now because I kind of found it a bit annoying at times the idea of a one-shot scene. But now that I might actually have to rewatch that movie. And
It
speaking
makes
of the movie, I talked a while ago a two-part episode, and this is mainly about the Second Indian Army in the Second World War. But what I found interesting about this, and we talked about how little the colonial armies are represented in both movies and
yes,
in historical work, is that you actually see an Indian soldier in
you
that,
do.
and like the historian said, you would have seen much more if, but still you have one Indian soldier there that is represented in the movie as well. That's what I found fascinating about the movie.
Yeah, one of the big things I think one of the it was both a benefit and I think a regret for a lot of historians during the First World War centenary, that kind of 2014, 2018 period,
Mm.
is that certainly in Britain, there was an increase in kind of public awareness of the empire. There's a lot of Indian soldiers, there's a lot of
Yeah,
soldiers from the colonies, there's a lot of soldiers from the dominions, fighting in Europe and then fighting in kind of the Middle East and
mm,
Mesopotamia and the like. But at the same time, I don't know if it quite made enough cut through into what that actually meant to be able to draw upon upon an entire empire,
yeah,
and what the if we're going to talk, as I was earlier, about what the transnational experience is, what is the Indian soldier experience of fighting in the First World War, and how does it kind of interrelate with, say, the British experience? How do Indian soldiers interrelate with soldiers from the French Empire,
mm,
for example? If we start kind of spreading some of these transnational lines around, and I don't think enough of that made it through kind of to the public
yeah.
from historians about what it means to be in an imperial
Yeah,
war.
I mean, we discussed this as well, that even in modern history books, colonial troops are heavily neglected, and it's more presented as a white man's war. When
Yes.
we know, even the First World War, we know there were colonial troops, you had Canadian troops, you had Australian troops, maybe not many as well as Jamaican or African troops from in the First World War as you would see in the Second World War, but still you had colonial troops
Yeah.
in. I mean, when it comes to using colonial troops, they mainly talk about the white ones, like the Canadian, like I said, the Canadians or Aussie troops. And they real even modern historians tend to neglect the use of colonial troops. As we know, and to go to the sequel of this, the Second World War in Dunkirk, you know that there were Indian soldiers in Dunkirk, but and rarely sees historians mention I mean, maybe just a few lines in the passing, but they don't get that much attention to it. If it's not, unless it is Canadian or Aussie troops that
Yeah.
is in the
There
picture.
are there is a definite kind of racial hierarchy within the British Empire when it comes to colonial troops. Now, there have been historians who've done some really amazing work on it. So people like Santanu Das, who works at King's
Ashley
College.
Jackson wrote the brilliant work. This is it's a Second World War though, but
Yeah.
not.
So, but for the First World War, you get Santanu Das, Dia Gupta, Anna Maguire, Samrani Boniger have all done different aspects on kind of the colonial experience.
Yeah,
Um, of the war. But there's a historian. Again, it's an interesting way of looking at history through public interaction because it's a computer game thing. There's a historian called Stefan Quiroga who wrote an amazingly good book about basically kind of online reactions to the game Battlefield One,
mm,
and he talks about the First World War existing in some mindsets as being a white mythic space,
mm,
that it's a white man's war, it's purely white people, and the introduction of any colonial soldier to that space who is not white is basically kind of like a culture war thing. Whereas the reality is that by 1917, 1918, there are like 40, 60, 80 different nationalities just around Ypres. And those are largely made up of British Empire and French Empire, and like then you start adding in kind of Canadians and Australians and some Americans and the like. That it is a massively multinational war,
yeah,
and because it's a massively multinational war, a significant number of those um, are soldiers from India or the West Indies or
mm,
Africa and the like. That the First World War and certainly the Western Front is in no way a white man's space. And yet the kind of the concept of it that has come up in some aspects of kind of popular culture and popular remembrance
mm,
is that it is just a war fought by 17 white guys named George and Fritz,
yeah.
and it just isn't true.
Did Germany use anti-colonial troops in the First World War, or was it purely mainly German
They did draw on some
troops?
colonial troops. I mean, Germany's empire is not as kind of widespread as the British and the French
Yeah.
one. So some a decent chunk of their colonial troops get used in the colonies. So in East Africa and the like, where ironically they fight the Portuguese. Going back to a pet topic earlier on, but the Germans at various points complain to the Allies, basically, I kind of both in the newspapers and through things like the Red Cross, about the British and the French introducing colonial soldiers to Europe to fight white men, and they think it's beyond the pale. They just don't think it's civilized to use these types of people in a white European war as they conceive it. Um, but there's also an element within the German army of needs must. So when they need to draw on their colonial troops, they will draw on their colonial troops, but they don't use them particularly to your large numbers, as is my understanding, and again, very much not an expert on the German Empire. But they tend to use them in the empire rather than in Europe, and part of that is the difficulty of getting them from the empire. Germany is surrounded on all sides. For much of the war, it's not like they can bring them in through the North Sea because there's a Royal Naval blockade, and the British and France are in the way. Italy's in the way to the south. Russia's in the way to the east. There's very limited opportunities for them to bring colonial soldiers into Europe proper. There's routes through the Ottoman Empire and through Austria-Hungary and up to Germany. But it's a pretty laborious route for them.
Now, let's go and move a little bit further east to the Ottoman Empire and talk about especially the Gallipoli campaign. And I mean, people tend to kind of think of the Ottomans as sick man of Europe and how underdeveloped they were. But of course, they did get massive help from the Germany in the
Yes,
German Ottoman alliance that for I would say in early 19th century that of course they were heavily in debt, but and they were supposed to get this cruiser from Britain that never happened, but they you have to remember they did fight quite ferociously
yeah,
in the World War One. They fought the Russians on one front and then the British in the other, and people you would expect them to kind of capitulate in the first year when they joined the war. I believe they joined in 2015, if I remember correctly. But still, they held on
yeah,
just about a month before Germany capitulated. They themselves ended up capitulating. So they fought quite bravely. Of course, they were atrocious with
yes,
the Armenians, and we will talk about that in a second. But they still don't recommend the soldiers were actually holding on so long as they did in the war, even if they were underdeveloped and maybe unmanned as and possibly outgunned as well. So you
yeah.
have to commend the soldiers and the adversity for fighting back on two fronts almost alone in that area. Like you said, you had the Russians and the British on one side.
So the Ottomans have a weird place within how the Allies conceive of the situation, in that they are both over and underestimated. In that the Allies, particularly the British, have a fundamental misconception about how the Central Alliance works. So their view, particularly, which is kind of one of the things that kind of motivates the Gallipoli campaign, is that they believe that Germany is being propped up by its allies. You know, Germany is being propped up by Austria-Hungary, it's being
Yeah,
propped up by the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria and the other nations. And if you can knock those allies out, Germany will collapse. So, you know, the idea, well, we'll knock Ottoman Empire out of the war, we'll capture Constantinople, gives us another route into Eastern and Central Europe, but also it'll deprive Germany of a valuable ally and they'll be less able to fight. Um, and the thing is, that is completely wrong. It's absolutely the other way around. That Germany is propping up all of its allies. It's propping up Austria-Hungary. It's propping up the Ottoman Empire. It's sending them weapons and supplies and the like. It's Germany that's keeping all of these allies fighting. It's a tremendous drain on Germany. It makes it very, very hard for them to fight the war. Um, so whilst overestimating the usefulness of the Ottomans, the British also underestimate how good fighters the Ottomans might be. The thought that actually, firstly, they'll just force the Straits of Dardanelles, and then it turns out, oh my God, there's a lot of minefields and fortified guns, and they're going to sink our fleet before we can get through the Straits and get to Constantinople. So, okay, we'll have these Gallipoli landings, and we're not expecting heavy resistance. We should be able to push past the Ottomans. And it turns out, the Ottomans are incredibly dedicated to
yeah.
protecting their country,
I mean,
and
of course,
willing to,
Ataturk as well, especially with this famous "I order you to die, not to
yeah, I don't
speak."
order you to fight, I order you to die. And by
Yeah,
the
yeah,
time
yeah,
that we're all dead, reinforcements will have arrived.
yeah.
So they're absolutely dedicated to fighting, to protect their own land, and they know the territory, even though you're fighting in the middle of nowhere, effectively at Gallipoli. They know the territory and the land so much better than the British and the French do. So
Mm.
put up a very, very good defense
And on
at.
top of that, it would be Churchill's greatest humiliation in if not history of his life as
Yeah,
well.
Churchill does not come out of this looking very good at all. And then you think, well, the Ottomans are fighting at Gallipoli. They're also fighting in Mesopotamia, and they're fighting in Palestine, and they're fighting the Russians in the Caucasus. It's a big series of fronts that they're putting on. But they are also, because they are the sick man of Europe, not really in a position to adequately supply themselves. They're draining away their men. They're draining away their resources. As the war goes on and the naval blockade starts to really bite for Germany, there's less that they can give the Ottomans in the way of support. And Ottoman society and the state is not strong enough to survive the the pummeling that a total war gives it. The
Yeah,
fact that all aspects of the state start to break down, and to solve those problems, you start having things like the Armenian genocide, where the Ottomans start
yeah,
looking around, going, "Okay, these are the people who are to blame, and that we'll just massacre them, and we'll march them out into the desert, and we'll leave them there." Um, and that's a really kind of clear example of the way that the violence of the First World War radicalizes and escalates and begets violence, begets violence, begets violence, and it feeds really well into the Greater War theory that actually, the whilst this might start during the First World War, it's not limited to the end of the armistice in 1918. This is going to last longer than that.
yeah. So I find it kind of funny how Russia termed the Trojan sick man of Europe, and they not, let's face it, they were not much better themselves, were they?
Yeah, in their stone and
Let's
glass
look
house
today at
emporium as they
the
start throwing insults
yeah.
around.
Let's take a look at the state of Russia and compare it or any other nation. The Ottomans, well, it may not have been necessarily a fun place to use that word to live in.
Yeah,
It was certainly not any worse than Russia or any Austria-Hungary or any other places in Europe.
yeah,
But
no one.
I think it's wrong to use the term the sick man in Europe, because we need to compare as well to other situations such as Russia, for example, where their citizens were treated appallingly, and especially even perhaps even worse than the Armenians in this case by their own Tsar. And so I think just time to kind of stop using the term sick man of Europe for the Ottomans and take a look at around, but where other empires better than much better really.
So I mean, yeah, nobody in Russia is having a great time
No.
in the lead up to the war, and they're certainly not having a great time when the war comes. I mean, the fighting for the Russians on the Eastern Front is different from the Western Front. You don't get these kind of big trench systems that you get on the
Mm,
Western Front and the Eastern Front, partly because there's so much more space, and you do have elements of war of maneuver still in parts of
mm,
the Eastern Front, and it's one of the things that ends up getting the Russians into a lot of trouble when various of their armies get rolled up in big kind of surroundings and all taken prisoner or captured. But I think that the best way to really understand the Ottoman situation, and it's sorry, the Russian situation, and again, it's not that different from the Ottoman Empire. The
yeah.
Russian state at the beginning of the war is not strong. The society is not strong. There is no kind of shared link between the people and the government and all of these things, which makes it incredibly vulnerable to the demands and
And
the
I believe with this justice in our episode on John's orders as well. I remember Nicholas says that reading the Nicholas, and I don't remember him saying that, of course I wasn't born yet, but I remember reading that in his biography that he said to British official that we are like decades, at least 2 decades behind, if not
yeah,
century behind, militarily than the rest of Europe as
yeah.
well.
So the best way to understand the Russian situation at this point in the war is that there's a view that the Russian steamroller will one day start rolling and just roll over Eastern Europe and smash the Germans to bits, and then everybody's concerned that it might not stop in Germany. It might head on to Belgium and France and all those bits and pieces. But there's an understanding that what Russia has
And
a
they
lot of
did go
is
to France in 1814.
yeah, 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 yeah. They dealt with Napoleon in the end. And the Russian steamroller definitely comes into effect in the Second World War. But what Russia has in the First World War is lots and lots and lots of humans. They are very well stocked in human
Yeah,
beings, and a lot of those are men of fighting age. What they don't have a lot of is literally everything else.
yeah,
So the best way of understanding what Russia has, or the problem they have, is that there is a Russian expeditionary force in France in on the Western Front during the First World War, because the Russians sell soldiers in exchange for munitions, rifles, arms, explosives, and the like. Because what everybody on the Western Front needs is more men. We need more men. We don't have a huge population. The Germans, there's lots of them, and they've all got machine guns, and they're very angry. We need more men, and Russia has plenty of them, but it doesn't have anything. It doesn't have weapons to give them, so they sell soldiers to the French in exchange for arms, and that is the perfect encapsulation of the Russian problem. in the First World War, that they have lots and lots of men, but they don't have
Mm.
the ability to arm them adequately. And when it becomes increasingly clear that not only is Russia not winning the war, that it will probably lose the war, the Russian military front and the Russian home front, neither of them are strong enough or willing enough to put themselves through any more unnecessary pain for a war that they're not going to win. And then you get the revolution and the kind of complete disintegration of the Russian Empire. Because when the demands of total war really come to bite, everybody at home saying, "Well, I'm starving to death," and yet the Tsar seems to still be having lots of parties. That doesn't sound super cool. And we're starving to death, and we were already starving to death before the war, and it doesn't appear that we're actually going to win it. So what's the point?
Yeah.
Everybody who are fighting in the
What do we
army
have
is
to
like,
lose? Nothing.
"Yeah,
When you come from nothing, you get nothing.
yeah."
So
So
like,
what's the problem? And the soldiers saying, "So what's the worst that can happen if I just go home?"
mm,
Um, and then you see the disintegration
yeah.
spreads as basically the entire Russian society kind of collapses around it because
What do
it
I
just
care
wasn't
if I'm
strong
on a
enough to win the
German and
war.
Russian rule?
What's that? Sorry.
What do I care if I'm on a German or Russian rule? Doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, and also, what if I overthrow the Tsar and we have our own,
Yeah.
our own little Soviet Union as a treat? What's the worst that could happen if
Yeah.
we just tear it all
I'm
down?
not like a famine, genuine famine, or ethnic cleansing or anything like that can
Yeah,
happen.
yeah. I mean, because what it turns out to be is what's the worst that can happen is
Yeah.
5 years of absolutely horrendous,
Yeah.
violent civil war, which is just awful in every conceivable way.
Yeah.
But for a guy
We don't
starving
have
to
a
death
czar.
on yeah, but for a soldier starving to death at the front or a civilian starving to death at home, you kind of you can understand why some people will be, well, I'll pay my money and take my choice.
Yeah. So I want to ask because we are going to run up. So unfortunately, I could easily pick another hour on this, but unfortunately, we don't have time. But of course, it compares to the Second World War, but again, that was in Stalin. So, but
Yeah.
but in POWs in the Second World War were treated as traitors when returning home. Was it the same in the First World War that if you were taken as a POW, how were you treated by when on your return?
Is this just for the Russians or for all nations
For
that
the
you're
Russians,
for the
Russians.
Russians? For the Russians, it gets really complicated because they're basically viewed as being not necessarily traitors, but politically potentially compromised. You don't know if they're good communists. You don't know if they would have joined the Red Army or if they'd have been loyal to the White Army. And they're also fighting in an army that was sent over there by the Tsar. So, maybe they would have, maybe they wouldn't have been on our side. So you end up with big question marks over the loyalties of Russian prisoners of war after all. I don't know entirely at what point the Germans release them and they start going home and the like, but I do know that for a lot of I mentioned earlier the Russian Expeditionary Force in France.
Yeah,
So when the revolution comes, the French look at these guys and go, "Are you all just like communist rabble rousers? Are you going to try and spread a revolution through our soldiers? Because we're really not here for that."
yeah,
And they basically kind of gather up all these Russians and basically keep them in camps with machine guns pointed at them because they're massively politically compromised. And they basically treat them like a virus that might spread through the body of their army. Um, but after the war, a decent chunk of those stay in France because they don't think it's safe for them to go home to Russia. And you end up with little conclaves of kind of Russian emigres in Paris. There's a historian called Sofia Anisimova who has done some really really good work on Russian soldiers after the revolution who stay in France and kind of different parts of kind of Russian military experience of the First World War. So she should definitely be someone that you try and get
yeah,
on the show to
absolutely.
talk about Russian experience.
Now, of course, I gotta ask the biggest question regarding. I'm sure you know which one I'm gonna ask. I'm, I'm sure it's. Do you think Lenin was a German spy sent to the to distract the Tsarist regime? No, sorry, Kerensky regime, I suppose. At this point, do you think he was a German spy?
I don't think he's a spy, but I think
German
it's
assets.
relative.
Sorry, German assets.
Um, I don't even know if I'd call him a German asset. What I think I would refer to Lenin is another example of the German short termism at this stage in the war. in that, it's them who allow, it's clearly Germany who allows him to return to Russia in the hope that he will stir up exactly basically what he does stir up and collapse the Eastern Front, and that will allow Germany to, focus all attention on the Western Front. But they don't spend an awful lot of time thinking about what an enormous Bolshevik revolution to their east might mean for Germany in the long term. In the same way that in at the end of 1916, when Germany decides to go to unrestricted submarine warfare in the hope of knocking Britain out of the war really, really quickly and starving them out, they are concerned about what it might mean for America and American neutrality, but they're so short-termist in that, well, if we knock Britain out before America joins, then it won't be a problem. If Lenin stirs up a revolution in Russia and we win, then it won't be a problem. We're not going to look more than about 5 or 6 days in front of us, rather than what this might mean in 6 months' time or 2 years' time, and the like. So I don't think Lenin has any particular love, and I don't think he's working as an operative for the German government. I think that Germany sees a short-term benefit to letting him back into Russia,
Mm.
and Lenin sees a definite benefit to being in Russia and getting the revolution started. And then I think both sides, I don't think Lenin would have had any issue with the revolution spreading to Germany, and I think Germany are basically hoping that it doesn't come to that.
Mm. Now, of course, we're going to run up in a few minutes because we don't have more time. But I'd rather discuss your book, and and you have one book called World War One in video games, which I just really want to read at some point, and I don't have you back discussing that book. But let's talk a little bit about World War One, both in video games and in movies. And there's not a whole lot movies. There's a whole lot more, of course, on the Second World War, but there is a few on the First World War as well. And more recently, the All Quiet on the Western Front movie that came out on Netflix a few years ago. But
Yeah.
let's talk a little bit about representations of the First World War in both video games and the in movies and TV series.
So the cinema one is really interesting because you're right, there is not a comparative like body of work for First World War films as there is the Second World War. And Second World Wars have come films have come in big batches over various portions of time. It's a bit of a
It's a genre in itself.
yeah, it absolutely is. But what that means is that there's less cinematic stuff for First World War games to draw on. You can't, as I said earlier, you can't do a Saving Private Ryan
Yeah.
equivalent for the First World War. And for years and years and years, people basically thought that the First World War was too boring to be the setting for computer games. And you just go over the top and you die, and
I,
and
I
that, and
mean,
that would be it.
to be fair, it can be a bit daunting to read about the First World War at times.
Yes. But what became interesting in the lead up to, so for years and years and years, basically the only First World War games that existed were flight simulators. You'd be the Red Baron in a biplane and you'd fly around. And then in the lead up to the centenary, a couple of really interesting confluences of circumstances happened. Second World War computer games became less popular
Mm.
because there was very little new to do in them. Once you've stormed Omaha Beach 12 times, is the 13th going to be any more interesting than that?
Yeah.
And you saw games like Call of Duty and Battlefield move into like future war. They did like a little bit of like the Iraq War and the War on Terror, and then they moved into like Jon Snow in space for Battlefield 2041 or whatever the hell it was. But there was a desire amongst a certain subset of games developers to return to historical games and show the audience something new that they hadn't seen before. And you got games like Verdun by Blackmill Games, that was a online first-person shooter set on the Western Front, and it showed that actually it wasn't boring. People would get really into it because it was a big game. You'd be playing with like 32 other people, going over the top and getting killed. So what? You respawn in a minute, and you're shooting with iron sights. You don't have like a heads-up display and anything like that. It's a game of skill, and gamers like games of skill. You then get really hot on its heels a game that I love called Valiant Hearts, which is like a point-and-click puzzle game with a narrative that stretches across the war. It's a beautiful, beautiful game, and I think everybody should go and play it. But what that proved is that firstly, you can set stories in the First World War setting, and also people don't know a lot about the First World War outside of mud, blood, death. Everybody dies.
And
You could
and what you learned in high school when they just it was the bad guys versus the good guys. But of
Yeah,
course, we don't have time to go into that. But of course, the First World War is much more
it's
complicated. I
much
would
more
say
morally
than
complicated.
bad guys versus good. It's less so in the Second World War. It's more obvious that it's bad guys
Yeah,
versus
in the
good.
Second World War,
I'm
there's
not
no
gonna get into that. But yeah,
yeah, but in a Second World War game, there's no downside to shooting a Nazi in the
no,
face. In the First World War games, it's they create it as like a moral conundrum, and you can shock the audience with stuff that actually happened in the First World War, but the audience doesn't know about. And I've said for years that Verdun plus Valiant Hearts equaled Battlefield One, which probably has a claim to be the most successful piece of First World War media ever created. Um, the amount of copies it sold is insane. And whereas if you try and say, oh, it sold 12 million copies, but 12 million people saw 1917 or saw They Should Not Grow Old. Yeah, they saw it once. People who bought Battlefield 1 were playing it every day for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. So it probably is the most successful piece of First World War media ever created. And then when the First World War centenary came to an end in 2018, there was an expectation that maybe First World War computer games would kind of go out of fashion because it was tied to a very particular moment in kind of public remembrance.
yeah,
And it hasn't happened. Like more First World War games are being created now than were in the years before the First World War centenary.
that's
So Verdun
fantastic.
produced a sequel which was Tannenberg, set on the Eastern Front, which then produced a sequel, Isonzo, set on the Italian front. There have been games that have come out in the last year and a half. There's a game called The Last Train Home, which is about soldiers of the Czech Legion trying to make their way back by train through the Russian Civil War, the long way round through Siberia and the like. If you'd have told me in 2013 that that would be a computer game that people would be interested in,
That's
it's like, no one's
awesome.
going to care about the Czech Legion traveling by train through the Russian Civil War. No one's going to play that. And yet they did, and it was really successful. There's a game called War Hospital, which I really like, which is like a resource management game, but you're in charge of basically a casualty clearing station behind the lines of on the Western Front. And you're starting to see First World War games move into like genres that you wouldn't expect them to. And it's really, really interesting that you're going to have this linear, ongoing creative opportunity presented by the First World War accelerating rather than decreasing after Centenary in computer B. Centenary was started 11 years ago. But we are still seeing new First World War computer games coming out. It's fantastic.
One thing I would like to see is, and of course, Assassin's Creed had kind of downhill after Odyssey, but I would love to see an Assassin's Creed game set in the First World War. They kind of got teased a little bit about this in Syndicate.
Yeah, that could be
That would be
really cool. Set it in the
fantastic. That
trenches.
would be so great. But
Yeah,
of
yeah,
course,
I'd get on board with that.
I got one last question before we're done the journey. But of course, there's is in music as well. The First World War, especially Irish folklore, and in more recently is Sabaton, and we talked about this on Instagram as well.
Yeah.
Sabaton is of course famously done metal songs about Verdun and other World War One and Second World War historical events. So what are your thoughts on the First World War in music, such as Sabaton or Irish folklore as well?
Yeah, so I'm much less au fait with the music side of it. Although there are a couple of historians who've done some really good stuff on it. So for Sabaton and the like, so I co-present a podcast called Oh What a Lovely Podcast, which is about popular culture in the First World
Sounds
War,
like a lovely
and we did an
podcast.
episode. Oh yeah, it's exactly it's right there in the name. And we did an episode on heavy metal music, and had a colleague of mine, Julia Ribeiro Tomaz, who's a First World War historian and also a big heavy metal fan, come in and talk about that. So I would recommend people check that out because the First World War way that it works in heavy metal is really, really, really interesting.
It
I
shouldn't
just
work,
don't know
but
enough about
it does somehow.
yeah, but it does work. With regards to kind of traditional music, a colleague of mine, a friend and colleague of mine called Emma Hanna, has done some work about music during the First World War and kind of in the aftermath of the First World War, which is really, really interesting. So you get kind of music hall and songs
Yeah.
during the war, and then the way that the war is remembered after the war in kind of Irish folk music and the like. And obviously, the Irish experience of the First World War is hugely fractured depending on kind of Republican or loyalist or Protestant or Catholic kind
I
of
mean, personally, I love Irish
allegiances.
folk songs. And for me, some of the songs are still with me, and I tend to listen to them once in a while because they're such good songs. I'm really
Yeah,
genuinely, I
and a lot of them
grew
then
up
end
with
up
Irish
being
songs.
yeah, and a lot of them end up turning into like Republican protest songs
Yeah,
or fighting songs, effectively, that are used to kind of stir up Republican fervor about
yeah.
the British Empire. So yeah, there is some really interesting stuff that I'd recommend about that.
Hmm. Now, I think we're gonna round up. I know you're gonna pick up your missus soon, so we're
Yes, I
gonna.
have to head off in just a moment.
Yeah, before you go, of course, do you have any social media where people can find you? If you have, people have further questions about World War One, of course, for your
Yeah.
podcast, where can people find it? So, and other stuff you want to share before you go?
So yeah, I'm on a variety of social media. Maybe some of them much less than I used to be, given
Same, yeah,
everything.
same.
So you can find me on Blue Sky, Chris Kempshaw. You can find me on Instagram, Chris Kempshaw. You can find links to a kind of like a bunch of my other stuff, including Oh What a Lovely Podcast. Although if you just Google Oh What a Lovely Podcast, it'll almost certainly come up. But if you go to chriskempshaw.com, which is my website, you'll get links to the podcast. You'll get links to all of my books, like academic articles, stuff that you might be able to read online, as well as like Star Wars stuff
Yeah.
as well, which people might like to.
Mm. Thank you so much for coming on. This has been a great pleasure to talk to you again. You can check
Thank you for
another
having me.
episode called The Guns of Audius. This is, of course, inspired by Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of Audius. It's about the first month of World War One. It's a great episode. You should check it out. You can find us available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. We are available on social media under that H12, under Instagram, X, or Twitter, on Blue Sky as well, and then with that H12. My name is Alan, this has been with that H12, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
There you go. What do you think?
That was good. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah. So I'm gonna let you go. Sorry for being a bit of a time. I
Oh,